Welcome to Casual Friday. So it's still February, so I'm still working on to finish it February. So today I'm going to tell you the 3 things that cause a work in progress to become a UFO, an unfinished object for me. Next, I'm going to update you on my Finish It February projects. I'm going to talk about using magnets as closures for sweaters or other garments. How to handle, or how I handle, yarn ramen, that really kinky yarn you get when you rip a project out. So I'll have links to all of the different sections down in the description below if you'd like to jump around. So let's get started. Now, there are lots of reasons why projects might become a UFO, an unfinished object. For me, there are typically it falls into one of 3 categories. The first category is one that I've talked about many times, and that is simply the amount of time I have spent so far working on the project. I have found over the years that I personally have about a 3-week tolerance for working on the same project. I will sometimes put the project aside for a couple of days in order to work on a small project, something like a hat or a pyramid, something quick, maybe it's a gift, and then I'll return to that project. I have a very difficult time really working on 2 things at one time. When my kids were younger and I was carpooling them around and I had to spend a lot of time waiting at skating practices or swim meets or whatever, I would frequently bring a really easy project, a mindless project with me, and I would keep it in the car, keep it in my purse, and then at home I might work on something else. That works for a lot of people. A lot of people have multiple projects that they actually are actively working on at the same time, but I find for the most part I cannot do that. So after 3 weeks of working on the same thing, I am ready to start something new. Usually at the 3-week point, I'm not learning anything new. It's just become a slog. And I know that about myself, but I also know now that I can and will return to that project if I still want it at a later time. It's just that I won't be able to finish it right then. I usually need a couple of months break from it. So the second reason I can put something to the side is that there's a mismatch of some sort. Now, the mismatch could be between the yarn and the project. I might really like the project and I might really like the yarn, but they just aren't working well together. Or it might be a mismatch between me and the yarn or me and the pattern. And in either one of those cases, I typically won't get very far in the project and before I'll put it to the side. But there's something about it that makes me not just rip it out and say forget it. There's something that makes me think, no, I might want to return to that later, and it goes into the bin. The final category is that I've made some sort of mistake that's going to require me to rip quite a bit of the knitting out, or I've come to a place where I have discovered there's a problem that I have to solve, and I'm not sure how to solve it, or it's a problem. I'm not sure how to solve it, or I think I might know how I want to solve it, and it just seems more work than I want to deal with at the moment. When the problem is a mismatch between the yarn and the pattern, that is something that I will typically stop really early. And so when I'm evaluating all of my UFOs, those projects are pretty easy to identify. And I will, and I'll remember that there was some issue with it, like this was really hard, or sometimes I don't. I think, well, this is really pretty. I really like this. I wonder why I put it to the side, and I'll start up again and I'll go, oh, okay. This is tedious, or this is too difficult, or the yarn and the pattern are fighting with each other, and there's no way I'm going to finish this. I need a different yarn for this particular pattern. This yarn is lovely and will be good in a different situation, but this is not it. And in that case, I actually will rip it out and rewind the yarn and put the yarn back in my stash. Sometimes the mismatch is not between the yarn and the pattern. They're working together beautifully, and the mismatch is that I am not enjoying the process. Maybe I'm finding the stitch pattern really tedious, and I just can't bear to continue with it, even though I know the finished item is going to be really beautiful or adorable. And that's what keeps me from ripping it out right away. I keep thinking, well, if I could persevere through it, I would really like the end result. So I have to kind of evaluate is what my motivation is to get that end result. Is there something compelling reason that would cause me to continue working on this? Sometimes there might be, and sometimes there isn't. One of the big surprises to me back in 2016 when I took out every UFO for the first time and really took stock of the entirety of my UFO pile, I was a little sick to find out that there were more than 40 projects in that pile. But then I was able to say, oh, that's about how many projects I would do in a year. So I could just treat these all as projects for this year. And that would be one way of getting through all of them. So I was like, okay, that's fine. The shocker for me was seeing how many unfinished sock projects I had, because I don't consider myself a knitter who has second sock syndrome. Socks are a project that I can typically finish in 2 weeks, sometimes less. So I never, or rarely, I shouldn't say never, I rarely get to that 3-week point where I'm just tired of it and I want to work on something else. So typically, I can get through those projects. So I was just surprised at the number of them that there were. So I had 17 or 18, and when I took a look at my Ravelry notebook, I have my sock projects all in one particular sort of folder, and there's about 120. So it's not like I can't finish socks. I mostly finish socks. I just hadn't realized how many had accumulated. And when I took a look at them, what I saw was that most of them had either a problem, like I'd gotten to a point and I was going to have to rip something back out, or it was a mismatch between me and the yarn is typically the reason. Over the years, I've discovered that while I may really like a beautiful sock yarn, it might be variegated, or it might be something that I could just knit in stockinette, and it would make a beautiful sock, that I am incredibly bored by working a plain sock in stockinette that doesn't have something going on to keep my interest. So for me, what keeps my interest is self-striping sock yarn. But sometimes the yarn is really difficult to work with, like marled yarns, those barber pole yarns where you have, say, 3 or 4 plies and there might be several different colors all plied together. That is really difficult to read your knitting. And so I might, in those kinds of yarns, actually get through a full sock, but I have no desire to knit the second one. So that was a lot of what was going on back in 2016 with all of those unfinished socks. But there were some that actually had problems. And so then I had to figure out what is the problem and before I could continue knitting. And that is always a challenge. I really rely on my Ravelry notebook and keeping track of my projects in there to tell me things like what needle size I used or what gauge I was getting, how many stitches I cast on for a sock, that sort of thing, because it really goes a long way to getting me started back on the project again. So if the needles aren't in the project, I don't know what needles I used. Or if I took the needles out and put it on waste yarn because I needed the needles for something else, I really need that information. It's very helpful to me. I started a hat for my husband's birthday last year, so it's a work that was already in progress. It was a brand new project, and I allow myself to do that in February if it's something small and it's for a gift. And we have a lot of February birthdays in my family, so I'm almost always knitting at least one thing for somebody's birthday in February. And for my husband, I was knitting him a new hat, and it came out a little short for him. I started out with the knit one through the back loop and purl one, and then I turned and reversed in the opposite direction in order to knit this next bit in knit one, purl one, or knit one through the back loop, purl one, so that this could be flipped back and you would still see the twisted knitting. So this really has to be flipped back by only this much in order for it to look right, and it was just a little bit too short for him. So when I washed it and blocked it, I stretched it a little bit to see if I could make it be a little bit longer. And then it's been sitting on this mannequin head for a few days. So I just went and had him try it on, and it was long enough for him. So that was the first thing. So I finished that. So the second thing was there was a sock in progress that was one of my UFOs that I had said a couple of weeks ago that I had knit the leg and I really didn't like the colorway, but maybe I didn't hate it as much as I did before. But I decided ultimately, no, it's ugly. It has to go. So I took it to my knitting group on Wednesday and I said, here's what the colorway looks like, knit up this much so you can see if you like it. And I said, if somebody wants it, I won't judge them if they like it because I hate it and I don't want it. And so somebody actually said, oh no, I like it, I want it. So I gave it away. So next up are a pair of socks that I knit for my brother, who I call Sasquatch. And the challenge I had with this was that I had one sock complete and I'd started the second one and only gotten halfway through the leg. And from knowing what I know about putting sock projects to the side, I knew that something must have been wrong with this and I didn't know what it was. So I had to spend a little time looking in my Ravelry notebook at the project page I'd created for this pair of socks to see what I had done on the first sock, and then I needed to look at the second sock to see if I could figure it out. And what I realized was I was just about ready to start placing waist yarn for this is a peasant heel. So I about ready to place the waist yarn, and I realized I'd made a mistake. And the mistake I'd made was I'd forgotten to do a little gusset. So just increasing by a few stitches in the rounds previous to when I would have placed the waist yarn to mark the heel, that would give the heel more room and more length and more room around the heel diagonal to make a better fitting sock for my brother. I have to do something similar for myself, only I typically need to add up to 8 stitches prior to the heel in order to get a peasant heel that fits me. I would have to do that for a short row heel as well. I just prefer working a peasant heel to a short row heel, but otherwise they have the same shape to them, so either one would work. So one of the things about this pair of socks that is a little unusual is that early on in the first sock, I encountered a knot in the yarn. Now, normally, if I were knitting socks for myself, I would probably rip them out and I would just restart the yarn because I always have plenty of yarn left over when I knit socks for myself. But when I knit socks for my brother, I have to be really mindful of how much yarn I've used at different places so that I can predict whether or not I'll have enough yarn to finish. So one of the options that I keep open for myself is knitting the toes in a contrast yarn or knitting the heels in a contrast yarn. And for the peasant heel, it made a lot of sense to do the heel in contrast yarn. I've made socks for my brother before using the same yarn. This is a Cascade Heritage 150 or Cascade 150 Heritage, one of the two. It's a little bit thicker. It's like a sport weight yarn. So what I've done in the past when I've used that yarn is I've waited to the end and I see, well, how much yarn do I have? And do I have enough to do 2 heels? And then I'll use just the end of the ball to do the heels for both socks. Now the heels won't match each other, but the rest of the sock will match each other. So for this pair of socks, I decided to use a contrast heel in part because of this problem that I had at the top. I was going to have to wind off yarn in some way to make these socks match, and I just didn't know if I'd have enough yarn, so I did a contrast heel. What ended up happening, and I made the second sock to match. I wound off enough yarn in order, so I would have had to wind off like 3 stripes worth of yarn in order to make this green bit here at the top just as wide as it was in the first. But I ended up with extra yarn left over, which is really nice because when I was in Michigan in December for my niece's baby shower, I had made a hat out of leftover sock yarn for my grandnephew to be. And I realized as I was knitting it that the sock yarn I was using was leftovers from socks I had knit for my sister-in-law, who is the baby's grandmother, my brother's wife. And my brother said, well, can you make him a hat from leftovers from one of my pairs of socks? And I said, no, because I never have leftovers. But for this sock, I do. And I have contrast yarn that I could use as well to supplement if there wasn't quite enough yarn for it. So that's the good news is I have a use for the leftover sock yarn for these socks. So I'm taking a 1-week break from my Edwardian sweater. I did not sew it up last weekend. I realized that after all of that effort of knitting the sleeve cuff ribbing and the neck ribbing on these double-aught or 1.75 millimeter needles, that it was too tight. The ribbing was too tight and it wasn't going to work well. So with the Edwardian sweater, I originally found the pattern in a newspaper, and there was a drawing of the pattern. And then I found it in the Columbia Book of Yarns 1904, where there was a different drawing of it that resembled the fabric a little more. And then eventually I found the 1907 Columbia Book of Yarns, which also included the pattern, and it had a photograph of it. So I took a look at the photograph again, because the neck ribbing I felt like was super tight, but I didn't want to knit as long as they were saying. I had 45 rows done on the neck, and they were saying to work it for 57, and I thought it's going to be way too long. So I didn't know if the problem was that I wasn't knitting it tight enough, which I couldn't imagine. I just didn't know what the problem was. So I looked at the photograph, and then I could see from the photograph that actually the neck was folded over in half. And I looked at other similar sweaters from that era, and the neck ribbing in all the cases was that it was folded over, which suggested to me that actually the ribbing should be looser so that it would be long enough to be folded over. And I think it's also going to help a lot with sewing it into the body of the sweater. So I need to re-knit the neck on a larger needle, and I also need to re-knit the sleeve cuffs. And I just didn't have it in me to do it last week. I needed a break from it. As I've mentioned, I can work on a project for 3 weeks and then I get tired of it. And in this case, I've been working on it since December 26th. And I was keeping track of what days I actually worked on it. So I'd been working on it for 26 days out of that time period. And I am motivated to finish it, but I did need a break. I was just sort of exhausted from only working on that for so long. So I'll get back to it. It's been really fun to be able to work on other projects in the meantime. I've been talking about that front closure and trying to figure out how it worked. Let me just remind you. So to remind you what it looks like, you have these two edges right here that face each other. So they're not going to be overlapping. They're going to face each other. And the instructions said to face the back sides with ribbon and to close with buttons and buttonholes. And I was having trouble figuring out how to do that, and I eventually decided to use snap tape. I asked in the vintage knitting group if I was getting this right, if they thought I was interpreting this correctly, that these two pieces of fabric would be facing each other. One of the women said, yes, I think you've got it right, but I think what they would have done is used a ton of little buttons and buttoned it through to the right side of the fabric. So you'd have a button, say right here, you would have a ribbon facing here with a buttonhole, and you'd button it right through the opening between the stitches here. And you just have a whole ton of them. That's probably what they originally meant. So I thought that was really interesting, and that made a lot of sense to me. I'm not going to do that. I am going to use the snaps. But there were a couple of people along the way, enough people had suggested using magnets that I thought it was worth talking about how magnets can be used as sweater closures, but why I don't think that they are a good solution for this particular project. The sweater I'm wearing right here, I used to have a big button on the front, but the button cracked and it came off. So this sweater is closed with a magnet. It just, so I can pull it apart pretty easily. and then I can just close it again, and it stays closed. It stays, you know, it's tight enough, but I can easily pull it apart, but it stays closed really well for me. So I really like this. I did a video on this, I don't know, a couple of years ago, I think, about using magnets in this way. So I'll link to that at the top. At the time that I did it, I wasn't sure if it was going to work, and I didn't know how big the magnets should be. I didn't know how I should sew them in. There's a lot of things I didn't know about it. So I ordered a bunch of different magnets from a company called K&J Magnetics. I'll put a link down in the bottom. And I ordered different sizes of rare earth magnets that are meant to be used with clothing. So I bought them in different sizes, and then I bought them in different kinds of configurations. So like right here, I don't know if you can see, these are two like tiny little magnets. I don't know if they're like 3/8 of an inch. I'm not sure, but I have a separator in between them because the force is so strong that they could end up breaking each other. So these are not in any kind of casing at all. And so if you were going to sew this into something like a purse or whatever, it could work really well to put inside the lining of something, and it would work really well as a closure. But for clothing that you're going to wash at some point, you either would need to remove them every time you wanted to wash them, or they need to be in something that is waterproof. So they sell these kind of magnets in different sizes, but they also sell them so that they're in these little sort of envelopes. It's like a PVC envelope, and it can be trimmed a bit. So I have different sizes. So this is the same size as the ones that were not in a casing, but you can see how big the little square bit is, and they come together. Now, because they're in the casing, the strength of the pull between the magnets isn't as strong. Every time you put more distance between the magnets, they aren't as strong. So that was something I didn't know either, was, you know, how strong the magnet should be, and then what effect would having them be encased in this PVC envelope, how that would affect the strength. So this is the next size up that they have. It's probably 3/4 of an inch, and then they have like the 1-inch ones. I think the ones that I'm using in here are this middle size, about 3/4 of an inch. And what I did some testing with different fabric thicknesses, and I decided that these smaller ones would be good for fingering weight yarn. Like if you had a sweater or something made with fingering weight yarn, and you had a thickness of the fabric between the two magnets, that these would hold together. And that for worsted weight fabric like I'm wearing here, the 3/4 inch one was good. And then you'd probably want a bulky weight sweater if you're going to close it with a 1-inch magnet. So why do I not think that this would be a good solution for the Edwardian sweater? Well, for one thing, you'd have to have so many of them that, you know, the weight of these is not insignificant. I mean, for one closure, it's fine. It certainly isn't any heavier than having a button here or a couple of buttons along the length of a sweater. But if you had to do a ton of them, that would be a lot. And there's not fabric. There wouldn't be fabric between the two magnets. They would be in this form sewn on. Maybe you could put a ribbon to cover them up between them, but that would be very thin fabric. So that would probably be too strong. Like, this is not easy to just pull apart. You kind of need something in between, a piece of fabric in between them, to make it so that you could actually pull it apart. So while I do think magnets are a great solution for closures in some circumstances, they are not going to work in every circumstance, and I don't think it would work in this particular one where I need a lot of points of closure to bring those two edges together. The other thing to think about with magnets is if you are making something, you want to include a magnetic closure, and the person who's going to be wearing it has a pacemaker, these are not a good idea. And you don't want to use magnets on things that young children are going to have access to, because if for some reason that they swallow them, it can create real problems if that magnet is sticking to something else Maybe they've swallowed more than one thing, more than one magnet, and that can create a lot of problems in their intestinal tract. So you don't want to use magnets for someone with a pacemaker, and you don't want to use it for babies. People have asked me, oh, well, doesn't it catch on to metal things this is strong enough that it stays closed on my body, next to my body. Typically, if I have to frog yarn and it's really kinky, I just knit with it the way it is, knowing that it will smooth out later. This sweater is an example of that. This was a UFO in 2016. It had been a sweater. I had knit the back and the fronts and then put it to the side. I really liked it. I couldn't figure out why I hadn't picked it up again. And when I picked it up again, I realized there was a problem with the knitting of the front. The two fronts were not the same widths. And there was a design flaw, the transition from the ribbing to the cable pattern, that I didn't like. So I knew that they were going to have to be ripped out. And that's probably why I put it to the side. But I had another problem, which was that I'd used the remaining yarn for other projects. So I didn't have enough yarn to knit the entire sweater. So I ripped out the two fronts and I got contrast yarn. I re-knit them with this dark yarn. And then I knit one of the sleeves. And I think for whatever reason, maybe I had the yarn for this that was not kinky. Maybe I had some yarn and I could knit the sleeve with that. But with the second one, I had to use the recycled yarn. I really don't remember. I do remember that one sleeve was fine, but I was using kinky yarn for the other. And everything came out perfectly fine. I did need to soak in warm water in order for the fabric to smooth out. I soaked it originally in cold water, and the fabric of this sleeve was still a little ripply. And so I soaked it again in very warm water, and then it all smoothed out. Next week, I'm going to do a Technique Tuesday video on recycling yarn. So what to do when you have frogged a project and you have kinky yarn. What happens if you just use that yarn as it is versus how does it end up if you do something to relax the yarn before you reuse it. And we'll do a comparison at every stage of the way so that you can see whether or not it's necessary to do something about the kinkiness. So you can see what the kinky yarn looks like, how it behaves when it's reknit, what you can do to relax the yarn before reknitting, and a comparison of the final results in all of those cases. I think it'll be interesting. That's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.